Hello, and welcome to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's Introduction to the State's Draft Rail Plan 2050. We'll get started in just a moment with an introductory video about the rail plan before we move to a question and answer period with WisDOT's rail plan experts later in the session. Welcome, and thank you for your interest as we initiate the public review period for the Draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. I'm Matthew Sorensen from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, Bureau of Planning and Economic Development, part of the Division of Transportation Investment Management. Over the next 20 minutes, I will share information about the status of the Draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 and review a few key plan topics and the evaluation and analysis that was completed over the last 2 years. I will discuss the financial implications of the draft plan and explain the process for providing public feedback, whether that feedback is a question about the information provided in the draft plan or a comment to be considered for the final rail plan. I'll end the presentation with a short review of next steps and a description of how comments will be captured and compiled to inform the final stage of plan development. Before I describe the details of the draft plan, I would like to share a few logistical items with you regarding your participation and feedback. WisDOT encourages you to provide comments or questions, whether you're viewing this video in a live webinar session or watching a recording of a webinar that has already taken place. If you are participating online, please know the presenters cannot see or hear you. To share your questions or comments with the presenters, please use the comment form on the right-hand side of your screen to provide feedback. If you are using a mobile phone with video capabilities to view this video during a live webinar session, you will find the comment form on the bottom of your screen. The comment form will be available once the webinar has opened for questions and comments. If you are calling into a live webinar session without video capabilities, please send your comments or questions on the draft plan via email to dotwirailplan2050@dot.wi.gov. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will replace Wisconsin Rail Plan 2030, which was adopted in 2014. By adopting this plan, Wisconsin will meet the federal requirements set forth in United States Code Title 49, Chapter 27, which requires that states adopt a rail transportation plan in order to remain eligible for certain types of rail-related federal assistance. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will help Wisconsin remain competitive for available federal rail funding now and in the future. Wisconsin's long-range multimodal transportation plan is called Connect 2050. Finalized and adopted in May 2022, Connect 2050 is a vision plan that identifies goals and objectives to guide development of an integrated, efficient, and safe multimodal transportation system in our state. The draft rail plan provides policies and actions for implementing rail-related goals and objectives identified in Connect 2050. Connect 2050 describes what we need to do to continue providing a safe and efficient transportation system in Wisconsin. The draft rail plan describes how Wisconsin will accomplish these goals and objectives as it relates to freight, commuter, and passenger rail. The draft rail plan provides an overview of rail activity in Wisconsin, including freight rail, commuter rail, and intercity passenger rail. The plan identifies rail priorities for WisDOT and includes an environmental evaluation, equity analysis, and rail-related safety considerations. The plan also includes a summary of financial planning and funding opportunities and an illustrative list of rail projects in the state. The Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will be shaped through 5 distinct planning phases. Phase 1, kickoff. Phase 2, the pre-draft plan. Phase 3, the draft plan. Phase 4, the final draft plan. And Phase 5, final plan adoption. The kickoff phase included publishing a notice of intent and drafting a public involvement plan. The pre-draft phase included initial outreach and consultation, including with Wisconsin's tribal governments, to help scope potential plan issues and opportunities. Currently, the plan is in the draft planning phase, which includes a 30-day public comment period, after which WisDOT staff will review and consider all public comments received and revise the draft plan where necessary. During the final draft plan phase, a 45-day public review period will open. and a public hearing will be held. Stay tuned to Rail Plan updates for further information about the public review period and public hearing. Finally, after the final draft plan phase, the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 will be formally adopted by WisDOT and submitted to the Federal Railroad Administration later this year. Wisconsin's rail system supports both statewide and regional economic activity. The draft plan summarizes existing freight rail infrastructure and the major commodities that utilize that infrastructure to move goods into, out of, and through our state. The draft plan also summarizes current challenges and major capital projects. The draft plan identifies the 4 national, 2 regional, and 5 short line freight rail companies that operate in our state, transporting freight over Wisconsin's 3,200 miles of privately and publicly owned railroad track and 600 miles of publicly owned rail corridors leased by these companies. WisDOT has a long-standing commitment to transit services as a key part of a healthy economy. The draft plan and its support of commuter rail remains part of that commitment. The plan summarizes existing commuter rail services in Wisconsin and defines roles and funding programs necessary to continue planning for future needs. In Wisconsin, commuter rail is located in Kenosha, in the southeastern corner of our state, on the Metra commuter rail system. The Kenosha station served 350 daily passengers in 2018, offering 5 trains daily, Monday through Friday, and from 3 to 7 trains per day on the weekends. Metra is governed by the Illinois Regional Transportation Authority, and although Wisconsin does not provide state funding for Metra, WisDOT and Metra staff coordinate closely on safety and other rail issues. Intercity passenger rail also supports economic activity in Wisconsin, both regionally and statewide. Wisconsin's intercity passenger rail systems include Amtrak's long-distance passenger route, the Empire Builder, which has 6 Wisconsin stops from Milwaukee to La Crosse, the state-sponsored regional passenger route, the Hiawatha, which has 3 Wisconsin stops, 2 in Milwaukee and 1 in Sturtevant, and the Twin Cities Milwaukee-Chicago service, which when complete will connect Chicago to Milwaukee, Portage, Toma, and La Crosse on its way to Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota. Amtrak's Thruway bus service connects many major Wisconsin cities to Amtrak's Hiawatha and Empire Builder rail systems. Nearly 90% of Wisconsin residents live within 30 miles of a rail station or within 15 miles of an Amtrak Thruway bus stop. The draft rail plan includes 13 policies and 53 action items grouped into 8 categories. Policies identify what WisDOT plans to do, and action items describe how WisDOT plans to do it. Among the 8 categories, safety and security is first and foremost. Other categories include the impacts on freight rail of connected and autonomous truck freight, investments in programs for intercity passenger and commuter rail, and long-term viability of rail corridors and the branch and short line network. The draft plan outlines rail plan policies in Chapter 1 and Chapter 10. The draft plan provides a qualitative analysis of potential environmental impacts, including benefits and burdens, resulting from the operations, maintenance, and future development of our state's rail network in Chapter 8 of the plan. This analysis considered system-level impacts with a conceptual focus on a statewide scale. It is important to note that this analysis does not replace future project-level environmental reviews, which may be conducted for future federal or state-funded projects. Project-level environmental reviews are critically important and may include strategies to avoid, minimize, or compensate for potential environmental impacts of future rail development in the state. The draft plan provides an equity analysis, which assists WisDOT with identifying potential negative and positive impacts of railroads on equity groups identified under Executive Order 12898 and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The equity analysis also assists WisDOT to identify the needs of traditionally transportation underserved groups, such as individuals and families without access to a motor vehicle, those not able to or choose not to drive a motor vehicle, or who do not have reliable access to public transit. The plan's equity analysis will assist WisDOT in developing policies and actions that will help balance transportation needs with those of the environment, historic and cultural resources, and the needs of the people of Wisconsin. The draft plan also provides a system plan environmental evaluation as required under Trans 400.07 2B2 of the Wisconsin Administrative Code. This evaluation is required when proposals contained in a state transportation system plan, like the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050, are considered major and significant. A system plan environmental evaluation, or C, is more conceptual, qualitative, and general than environmental reviews for individual projects. The draft plan contains two scenarios. The first, a base case, assumes the continuation of existing policies and actions. The second, an implementation scenario, assumes full implementation of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 and includes all existing, revised, and new policies. The C requirement is satisfied by chapters 8, 9, and 11 of the draft plan. The draft plan summarizes Wisconsin's railroad safety and security. WisDOT, freight stakeholders, federal and state agencies, partner communities, and all Wisconsin residents share responsibility for the safety and security of our state's railway. Railway safety and security issues include collisions and derailments, shipment of hazardous materials, trespassing, emergency response, assessing vulnerability, and driver crossing practices at grade crossings. The draft plan's safety considerations are located in Chapter 7. The safety of Wisconsin's railways, highways, waterways, and airways is WisDOT's highest priority. The draft plan addresses the amount of funding available from various sources and Wisconsin's ability to spend that funding in Chapter 13 of the plan. Federal funds that can be used on rail projects are generally administered through the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, and in limited cases, the Federal Transit Administration. Passenger rail improvements are often federally funded with discretionary grants, which are competitive and do not occur every year. State funding is allocated through Wisconsin's biennial budget process and with state bonding. Both state and federal funds are required to have budget approval and are appropriated to various transportation programs by the state legislature. There are a variety of federal and state programs that contribute to funding rail projects in Wisconsin. Federal programs include the Local and Regional Project Assistance Program, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program, the Federal State Partnership for State of Good Repair Grant Program, and the Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grants. State programs include the Freight Railroad Preservation Program, the Freight Rail Infrastructure Improvement Program, the Transportation Economic Assistance Program, and safety programs funded through the Office of the Commissioner of Railroads. Funding programs are located in Chapter 12 of the draft plan. The draft plan includes illustrative project listing tables, which identify capital projects that are funded or anticipated to be funded, as well as unfunded projects and studies. The plan's project list will be updated as needed to reflect program funding cycles, discretionary funding awards, and other funded or unfunded projects. The project listing tables are located in Chapter 14 of the draft plan. Public involvement activities have been, and will continue to be, conducted by WisDOT during all 5 phases of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050's planning process. Since 2020, WisDOT has consulted with, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission Environmental Justice Task Force, tribal governments, and environmental resource agencies. WisDOT has also coordinated with Wisconsin's metropolitan planning organizations, regional planning commissions, the WisDOT Freight Advisory Committee, and hosted a freight rail conference, which included discussions of the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. Upcoming public involvement opportunities can be viewed on the Rail Plan's website at wisconsindot.gov/railplan 2050. The public comment period for the Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050 is now open and will remain open until February 26, 2023. All comments submitted by the public during this time will be considered as the draft plan moves through the final phases of its development. If you would like to submit a comment or question to our rail plan experts during the live webinar, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit a comment or question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed by WisDOT's Rail Plan experts in the order submitted. If your question is not addressed during the live webinar, one of our team members will respond via email at a later time. On behalf of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, I want to thank you for your interest and participation in the development of the Wisconsin State Rail Plan 2050.
Now we'll begin our question and answer session, when you will have the opportunity to submit questions to WisDOT's Rail Plan experts. Joining us today are Alex Gromovat, WisDOT's Planning Section Chief, Lisa Stern, WisDOT's Railroads and Harbors Section Chief, and Rich Kedzier, WisDOT's Freight Railroad Program Manager. If you are ready to provide a question to our Rail Plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our first question comes from Lisa. Lisa asks, what can the state do to help prevent the trains from blocking crossings for long periods of time?
This is Lisa Stern, Chief of Railroads and Harbors here at Wisconsin DOT, and I can address that question. So the trains that run through the state are regulated by the federal government and interstate commerce. So there's not a lot that a state or a local municipality can do to actually manage how the train is moving through the communities. However, with that said, currently the FRA is collecting information on blocked crossings. And if you Google FRA blocked crossings, there is a blocked crossing incident reporter, and they're collecting that, trying to get a good sense of what crossings are being blocked. Another option is also to report it to the Office of Commissioner of Railroads here in Wisconsin. It is important to collect that information because sometimes, although we cannot as a state agency or a local municipality regulate the train movement, sometimes there's some infrastructure improvements that can be made to alleviate the blocked crossings and to open up, especially considering for first responders and such. So I guess the important thing would be to report those blocked crossings to the FRA, the website. That's it.
Our second question comes from Lisa. Lisa asks, are there opportunities to develop more rails to trails or rails with trails in Wisconsin?
Okay, I can take that question as well. So there have been, historically, there were a lot of railroads that were consolidating, and that opened up a lot of corridors to be converted to trails or rails to trails. We have lots of those here in Wisconsin. However, in current day or current recently, freight rail is growing. So the industry is expanding. There's a lot less opportunity. There's a lot more growth and less consolidation happening in the industry. With that said, there are some very limited options, generally on the ends of lines, kind of sporadically throughout the state. But uh, probably that rail line that you see that maybe doesn't have that many trains, it is still active. It is probably got, potential to grow in the future. So those will not be likely converted to trails. On a note to rails with trails, that is not a recommended option. There's a lot of safety concerns when you're kind of putting together both recreational and industrial uses right together in the same corridor. So that can create a lot of safety concerns that we try to avoid. That's it.
Our next question is, will the Rhinelander to Goodman and Park Falls to Ashland lines be reopened?
This is Rich. I'll tackle that question. For those who don't know, those two lines, the Rhinelander to Goodman and Park Falls to Ashland, those are up in the Northwoods. Park Falls to Ashland is mostly in Price and Ashland counties, and Rhinelander to Goodman is in Oneida, Forest, and Marinette counties. So those lines have been out of service for several years. Park Falls to Ashland was subject to washouts in 2016. And Rhinelander to Goodman, I believe, went out of service. It was more than 10 years ago, probably closer to 15. And so what would it take to reopen those lines? Well, that would have to be determined by the new operator, the Fox Valley and Lake Superior Rail System, based on what they believe the prospects for new rail traffic and freight revenue would be to justify the economics of spending the money to repair and reopen those lines. Fox Valley and Lake Superior Rail System is owned by Watco. Watco purchased roughly 500 miles of active and inactive railroad lines from CN in January of 2022, and they are still adjusting to the terrain and determining what's feasible to reopen.
Our next question is, how much active railroad in Wisconsin is publicly owned?
This is Rich. I'll answer that question as well. The state of Wisconsin owns roughly about 600 miles of active railroad in the state, mostly in the southern part of the state, the southern counties. And a lot of those lines first acquired around 1980 and into the 80s. And there's roughly in the southern counties, the Wisconsin and Southern Railroad is the operator. And there's another 20 miles of railroad in Washburn County that is also owned by the state, that is operated by Wisconsin Great Northern Railroad. And that's my answer.
Our next question is, How does the plan address ways for local governments and WisDOT itself to raise funds for rail projects outside of the state legislative budget process that has been a dead end for past projects?
This is Lisa. I can try to address that. I think the rail plan itself is working within the current framework of funding opportunities. I would say that there has been rail funding from in Wisconsin from that's gone through the state legislature. It does support freight rail project improvements. It also is improving and supporting current, passenger rail that's on current routes. So there is funding there. As far as expanding funding, that's something we'll have to look at as we evaluate the options that are out there and see where we want to go. But the plan works within the current Wisconsin funding frameworks.
Our next question is, the published PDF form of the form is difficult to navigate online. Why did you not include hyperlinks within the document?
Alex, I can answer that. So if you download the PDF of the plan, there are actually bookmarks and internal references all throughout the document. The way that it's being hosted with Google Drive, it seems to not do it when you just open it on your browser window. But if you download the plan PDF, there should be bookmarks that are available.
Our next question is, with the FRA identification program deadline coming up shortly, will WisDOT be providing a letter of support for the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission and the intercity plan for Eau Claire to St. Paul?
This is Lisa again. So that's an easy question. Yes, we will be providing a letter of support to the Chippewa-St. Croix Rail Commission for their intercity passenger rail plan to enter into the Corridor ID program.
Our next question is, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, what are the next steps that WisDOT, local agencies, and other stakeholders need to take action?
Yeah, so this is so we are currently working on one of those routes. So, the route between Chicago, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis. There's a couple different routes that we have in the rail plan if you take a look. And these are the same routes that were in the 2030 plan. But one will go through Madison, one goes through La Crosse, and one goes through Eau Claire. Well, there's two of them, but those are the three kind of new locations. So the one through La Crosse, we are currently working on an infrastructure project, doing the final design. We've got funding for that project and working along with Minnesota, Illinois, and Amtrak to start service for that route. So that's in progress. I think as far as the public or locals, the thing to do would be to reach out to WisDOT or MnDOT, and if you want to find out more information about that specific project. Now, if you're talking about the extensions of that route to include other cities like Eau Claire or Madison, that will kind of depend. We are looking at submitting applications into the Corridor ID program. Those routes, there have been letters from the locals asking us to do that. So we're doing that evaluation. If we got accepted into that program, that would be a time then where we would do that planning, kind of evaluate the routes, look at what we would need from the locals, from the state, and from the railroad themselves. So there's right now, I guess, if you want to have any input, the thing would be to send in a comment to say what you think should be done along those lines, and provide your input that way. That's it.
Our next question is, how will WisDOT leverage its inventory of state-owned trackage for the public benefit?
Hi, this is Rich, and I'll try to tackle this question. I'm not sure what the author of the question might be assuming, but just from a freight standpoint, public ownership. What public ownership does is it helps reduce the capital requirements for our tenant operators, and which helps keeps freight rates relatively low, which is helpful for retaining businesses in our local communities, which might otherwise decide to locate elsewhere. It also, by keeping freight rates low, makes it more competitive with truck, especially on long distance traffic, which in turn reduces the amount of trucks and freight tonnage on highways, keeping them on railroads. If the author of that question has like a follow-up, please just submit a follow-up question. We'll get to it later in this meeting.
Our next question is, the passenger rail proposals, other than the TCMC, seem to be entirely proposals made by bodies other than WisDOT. What research has been done by WisDOT itself to investigate the needs of the people of Wisconsin for access to passenger rail services?
Yeah, so the passenger rail proposals that we've seen, for the most part, actually have been included in the previous rail plan, the 2030 rail plan, and are in the 2050 rail plan. The department, as part of this updated plan, we did do a passenger rail ridership analysis with statewide, looking at kind of a forecast for potential ridership needs of where there would be populations that would benefit from additional transportation options. So that was done and incorporated into this plan. So I think there has been action on the part of WisDOT to do those evaluations and to look at those studies. If the person's like maybe is talking more about the letters of expressions of interest that went to FRA, WisDOT is currently evaluating the role and what we're going to do for the corridor ID program. But there is ridership forecast data in this Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050.
Nothing over.
Our next question is, which stakeholders need to action the next steps to develop a southeastern Wisconsin rail freight intermodal facility, or to reopen the facility at the Port of Milwaukee? And what would those next steps be?
So this is Rich. I'll try to answer this question. Intermodal is it's not a straightforward issue to tackle, especially for a public agency, because it's really out of our hands. Intermodal facilities require very high levels of investment and stuff, especially if they're the large ones that you might see in the Chicago area. And the railroad has to want to serve the facility, and the steamship companies which own the containers also have to want or find an economic reason to allow their containers to go to that facility. So there's a lot of pieces to it, and we just don't have a lot of influence over it. We can help on the margins, as far as getting the supportive infrastructure in place, if that's a condition that the railroad or the steamship company requires. And at the Port of Milwaukee, for instance, we had provided some funding to improve the old CP intermodal site at the port, and the port made some investments to improve the track there, under the guidance of Canadian Pacific. And at that time, this was 2017, 2018, 2019. Canadian Pacific had expressed some interest, depending on business conditions, to reopen that intermodal facility, which is a rather small one, by the standards of other North American intermodal facilities, more of what we would call a boutique sized facility. So, but economic conditions changed in 2019 and 2020, and Canadian Pacific decided that they would not reopen that site. But again, it's with Chicago so near, the railroads it's a difficult question for them. Do they really want to open an intermodal facility in Southeast Wisconsin when they already have facilities in the Chicago area, less than 90 miles away in most cases? Do they really want to dedicate resources in Wisconsin that would, pull traffic away from their existing facilities in the Chicago area? In which case it also complicates their operation. So it's a very, very difficult question, and we generally don't have answers to that beyond trying to explain the problem, which is addressed in the intermodal report that WisDOT published in I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2019, but that can be found on WisDOT's website. I'm not sure if I probably didn't answer that question, but if the author of the question has any follow-up questions based on what I said, I'd welcome that, to see if we could try to narrow that down.
Our next question is, the Canadian Pacific Railway has proposed acquiring the Kansas City Southern Railroad. What impacts, both positive and negative, might this merger have on Wisconsin?
Again, this is not an easy question to answer. WisDOT has not studied this question in detail. The information we have comes from the economic impact statement that was provided by Canadian Pacific for the acquisition, and in that statement, they claimed that there would be no additional, net additional traffic in Wisconsin on the line that runs from La Crosse to Milwaukee, beyond like their expected natural rate of growth, under without the Kansas City Southern acquisition. Now that said, anytime you have a big transaction like this, it sends out ripples throughout the industry, and I can't anticipate what any negative impacts would be. I do know that some of the positive impacts would be is if shippers in Wisconsin have ship to Mexico or the Gulf of Mexico. Currently, they could see their freight rates decline They might have easier and faster access to Mexico and the Gulf, because with the addition of Kansas City Southern, a lot of the friction would go away. You'd have a single railroad move instead of two railroads to the Gulf and Mexico, which generally results in lower rates and faster movement of freight. And they will compete directly with, Canadian National for movements to Louisiana and the Gulf, which might further reduce rates. So I anticipate, from what I've read in the railroad world, that it'll be a net benefit to Wisconsin shippers, but it's yet to play out. So I might not have answered the question, but if Ethan has a follow-up question based on what I'd say, I'd be happy to address it.
Was it a light pole?
Our next question is from Brittany. The south central areas of Wisconsin have a significant proportion of our population that have limited transportation options, given our poor public intercity transportation options at present. When looking at proactively addressing transportation equity, is expanding passenger rail services to connect Beloit and Janesville north to Madison and south to Rockford and Chicago on the WisDOT radar? How quickly could a project like this move from planning to operation if supported?
So this is Alex. I can take a stab at this. So as far as the first part, it's really a two-part question. Expanding passenger rail service to connect Beloit and Janesville north and south. If you look in Chapter 14 of the plan, these projects like this are included as unfunded projects. So this has been studied for a long time by local governments such as the Janesville MPO. And we include projects like this in the plan illustratively to ensure that they are eligible for future funding opportunities if they present themselves. But as far as the second part of that question, how quickly one can move from planning to operations, that I think there's so many complicating factors in that we can't really speculate at this time how quickly it could be implemented. I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything to add.
No, that's true. It's each corridor would have a different timeline, but it would take years. So it would take, you'd have to study, make sure it could be what would need to be done. You'd have a service development plan. You'd have to do NEPA clearance, and that's all before you can do the design and construction that would be needed to establish passenger rail. I do want to reiterate that this is something that is on WisDOT's radar. It's even though it's not on the official passenger rail plan at this point, it is something that is talked about and looked at. But yeah, that's about where I would put it, is that it's on our radar.
Our next question is, has the state been working with the municipalities that submitted a letter of interest to the FRA regarding the Corridor ID program, and is there support at the state level for expanding intercity rail to Green Bay?
Yes, this is Lisa again. So the expanding state level, or excuse me, expanding passenger rail to Green Bay is in the rail plan. It is something we are evaluating. It was part of the passenger rail forecast I mentioned earlier. And there has been discussions, I think, at our leadership level and staffing level as well, between municipalities across the state that are interested in expanding passenger rail in Wisconsin. So there has been communication, and the Green Bay line is in our plan.
Our Our next question is, how does the plan address the tendency of the major railroads to see Wisconsin as flyover country for their transcontinental routes, providing poor service to Wisconsin-based customers to the point of actively discouraging use of freight rail? What solutions does WisDOT support?
Hi, this is Rich, and I'll try to tackle this question. So we do note that the Class 1 railroads aren't so good at serving the smaller shippers, and you know, BNS, what the experience of BNSF in Wisconsin after the merger of Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe, the BNSF became the largest railroad in the United States, and just due to their rates and what they saw as economical business, they stopped serving a lot of smaller businesses because the businesses, I'm talking on the Mississippi River, for example, in La Crosse and Prairie du Chien, some of the smaller businesses didn't like BNSF's service and their rates, and so they switched to trucking. And this experience has been replicated, with the other Class 1 railroads. And when I say Class 1 railroads, I mean Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Union Pacific. The experience has been similar. The larger railroads are very rigid with their rates, especially for the smaller volume shippers. And you just see a migration to trucking in that instance, or the business just isn't viable anymore. So the state's policy since the late 70s, instead of we don't have any authority over the railroads. We can't tell them how to serve customers or or how to set their rates. We don't have any authority over those. But what we can do is support other railroads, and we do that through the public ownership of railroads in southern Wisconsin and Washburn County. And we find that the smaller railroads, is what we call short lines, especially on a public ownership, are able to provide better service and lower rates compared to the Class 1s. And if those railroads have other options, if they are able to interchange with more than one Class 1 railroad, they can offer more competitive rates and better service than the Class 1 railroads. And we see that with Wisconsin and Southern Railroad, which operates in southern Wisconsin. So again, we don't have any authority. We don't have any leverage with the Class 1 railroads to provide better service or rates, but we can help provide alternatives.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I wanted to remind attendees that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, Union Pacific is actually under service orders by the STB for some customers.
So this is Rich. I see that it's not a question, and maybe William was kind of responding to the previous questioner in my response. But WisDOT, the Surface Transportation Board is a federal agency, and they are charged by federal statute. And shippers can petition the STB for relief, especially what William is referring to. Union Pacific had put a lot of embargoes all throughout the country due to, what they consider to be poor operating conditions due to staffing or congestion. And however, WisDOT, we don't get involved in those situations, and shippers, if they need relief due to what they can interpret to be poor service, they are able to petition the Surface Transportation Board.
Good point. Yeah.
Our next question is, are you able to provide an update on WisDOT's efforts to increase Amtrak's Hiawatha service frequency from 7 to 10 daily round trips?
Well, we're given
Yes, this is Lisa. I can provide an update on that. So currently we are working on projects. We are going to be letting the Milwaukee Airport Rail Station second platform. We are working with CP and FRA on the Muskego Yard project and CTC project, all in Milwaukee. And I bring those up because the movement of those projects will allow will allow for an 8th round trip. So we have the path set and laid out to us how to get to the 8th round trip. The 9th and 10th round trip will likely require improvements in Illinois that we are still evaluating with CP and Illinois Department of Transportation, Amtrak, and Metra. So that the 9th and 10th round trips is still being worked on, but we do have the path for the 8th round trip.
the other one. You're working in what, Grafton and
Our next question is, prior presenter comments alluded that the data regarding predicted passenger rail ridership for the 2050 plan was pulled forward from the 2030 plan. If this was accurate, what date was that data collected, and were there more recent efforts to study predictive commuter ridership numbers?
Yeah, so thanks for allowing me to clarify. So the data wasn't pulled from the 2030 plan, but the rail routes, so the corridors were. The passenger rail forecast evaluation we did was just done last year. So, and it looked at the rail plan, the routes that were in the rail plan. So there has not been a study to do just general predictive commuter ridership numbers outside of those corridors. If I guess as far as recommending, the next steps for individuals, commenting on the first step should be to send your comments and what you think the department should look at doing to the rail plan. That's one. I think the other way, and I think this is the same commenter that was talking about the Rock County connection, is to work with your local MPOs as well to help connect to WisDOT planning folks that way. But I think those would be the two next steps forward and what I'd recommend doing.
okay, this whole corner was depressed.
Our next question, what kind of ridership trends are you seeing on the Hiawatha as COVID concerns continue to wind down and we have more people returning to in-person work and other activities?
Yeah, so the Hiawatha ridership has been rebounding. We are continuing to grow and starting. We have not returned yet to 2019 ridership levels. we are seeing a different pattern of ridership, so it's not as strong kind of commuter peak trains in the morning as it was before. It's a little bit more spread out. Right now, some of our growth is restricted just by some of the equipment challenges that we're having across the country. And then I would say, we are expecting 23 to see additional growth ridership on the Hiawatha. I can't say exactly when we'll get back to 2019 levels, but we have been consistently growing ridership over the last year.
Next question. Speaking broadly, what differences do you see between this and the previous plan? And if significant differences do exist, can you offer insights on what factors are driving these changes?
This is Alex, I can take this. So between this and the previous plan, actually right as the previous plan was about to be released, there was guidance from the Federal Railroad Administration that came out on how to write these rail plans. So the driving changes between the previous plan and this one, from my perspective, are the FRA guidance document on what a state rail plan should include. So with that, that being said, we did a lot of data updates, and a lot of our analyses were updated based on more current data than what was in the previous plan. And our project listing tables obviously have been updated to reflect programmed and unfunded projects that have come up since the previous plan. So generally, it was an update of what was previously there, and then trying to plug in the additional information that the FRA guidance required.
Our next question is, passenger rail is artificially segmented into commuter, long distance, and intercity, state-supported less than 750 miles. It is the passenger, not the train, that defines the service type. For example, a Metro extension to Milwaukee could both relieve Hiawatha Line congestion and extend options for passengers, but WisDOT uses these artificial boxes. Do any of the experts have a response to that comment?
Sure, this is Lisa. I can respond to that comment. So those boxes are set by federal rules and regulations, and that 750 miles was set by the PREA law that Congress passed. So there it is a little bit, I can kind of see where this question is coming from, but the Hiawatha does connect, Milwaukee to Chicago. Metro extension, that would be something Metro would have to decide to do. We would work with them to evaluate that. We've, WisDOT's been open to looking and helping to support where we can, and we are limited where we can support commuter rail. There's some more restrictions on that type of rail service that's really more locally led. So I think there is a little bit of crossover between, especially those shorter distance intercity passenger rail projects versus a commuter rail project. But I don't see that these definitions are actually restricting WisDOT's role in helping it. It just kind of defines who will be the driving force in moving these types of services forward, and who would be the lead. That's all.
Our next question is, has Amtrak allowed 100% seating on the Hiawatha? They were restricting seating for quite some time.
Yes, this is Lisa. I can take this one too. So yeah, during the height of the pandemic, there was a restriction to 50% capacity to help, for health and public health reasons, that has been removed. So there is currently no restrictions and no requirements surrounding the pandemic. I mean, I think the only lasting impacts from the public health crisis we've been going through is the equipment shortage, is all kind of related to the complicated situation that the pandemic put the supply chain and labor force in. But for the rider, it is fully open with no public health restrictions.
While we wait for additional questions from webinar participants, I just wanted to remind attendees that if you're ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, recently the Federal Railroad Administration completed a Midwest Regional Rail Plan. This plan identified the Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Twin Cities corridor as the only core express corridor in the Midwest, with trains operating at higher speeds, such as 185 miles per hour or more. Does WisDOT view this higher level of service as something that can be achieved?
It's just
Yeah, this is Lisa. It technically it can be achieved. It would take a significant amount of infrastructure upgrades throughout the corridor and grade crossing probably elimination at those speeds and bridge building. So technically it can be achieved, but it would take a significant amount of funding and the upgrades throughout.
Our next question is, based on your experience, how much weight does the FRA and other agencies
Put on the information within and quality of a state rail plan when making grant funding decisions.
I can take this one, or if Alex wants to jump in too. So to have an adopted rail plan that's accepted by the FRA is almost a requirement to be provided for the discretionary grant application. So it's extremely important to have an adopted rail plan so that our state is eligible for FRA funding.
I have nothing to add. Thanks, Lisa.
The next question is, many of the southbound connections in Chicago from the Hiawatha are very poor. Is WisDOT addressing these and considering linking with Illinois to provide through service to St. Louis?
So this is Lisa again. Yeah, so we coordinate with all the Midwest states, and I know that Amtrak is actually also working on, has applied for a mega project that would improve those connections through Union Station. Some of those issues are kind of the way the track is laid out there and the train moves they have to do. We're continually working with the other Midwest states and Amtrak to try to improve the timing the best we can. There's a lot of restrictions and kind of things we have to coordinate to make that happen. Now, with that said, when the TCMC comes through, it won't connect to St. Louis, but it will be the Quincy route will go through the Union Station and up to the Twin Cities, and then we are talking with them to try to improve the connection timing for that route when the service does start, so that people can catch more trains outside of Chicago.
Our next question is, the baggage cars were also removed from the Hiawathas. Have these been located and restored for bicycle users? Amtrak also removed some of the passenger cars from the Hiawatha pool. Have these been located and returned?
This is Rich, and I'll take this question. So what I see here is two different, William has questions about two different types of equipment. Now, the Hiawatha had, instead of like dedicated baggage cars, they had these, what we call non-powered control units, which are basically old locomotives that have had the diesel engines removed from them. And these are old F-30 locomotives that are roughly 40 years old. And they created, once the diesel engines were removed from them, it created space for storage for luggage and bicycles. And they have, since Amtrak converted those F-30s to cab baggage cars or non-powered control units, they have been very unreliable, and Amtrak has a hard time getting parts for them because they're older, and so they haven't been in service reliably since roughly 2018, 2019. We do see them in service sporadically. We were assured by Amtrak that one of them had just gone through some maintenance and should be back in service shortly if it's not in service already. However, this it's not a reliable situation. We're not seeing them on every train every day, and so it's been very sporadic. And Amtrak has told us that these cab units that have baggage space on them will be retired very soon. Now, they've also told us that they are studying getting new non-powered control units that would have some baggage space in a couple of years. I know that doesn't satisfy a lot of people. I do know that they are allowing passengers to bring bicycles on a very limited basis onto the Hiawatha. And sometimes they're putting them in the table cars if the table car is available, and sometimes they're finding others kind of improvised space for them. So I'm sorry we don't have a good answer regarding baggage and space for bicycles. You'll just I would recommend you interact with Amtrak directly on that question. As far as the passenger cars, yes, Amtrak removed a lot of what we call the Horizon cars, removed them from the Midwest equipment pool. Some of them were mothballed in 2020 because they were due for overhauls, and Amtrak didn't want to pay for the overhauls since the Midwest is getting new venture cars. And some of those cars were shipped out of the Midwest, unfortunately. So we know some went to Washington State for their service because they were in need of cars after their Talgos were retired prematurely, their Talgo cars. So it's very complicated. We do expect that the availability of passenger cars will improve for Hiawatha. Hopefully this summer, as more venture cars of the new Siemens venture cars enter the Midwest pool and are accepted by the Midwest and Amtrak. Until then, we anticipate we'll be restricted to 4 cars for each train. And we don't anticipate having the full 6-car consist until later this year.
Our next question is, earlier there were comments about TCMC work being done in La Crosse that would help get service going on the Milwaukee to Minneapolis-St. Paul route. But also there are options under study to run more directly through Madison. Is the proposal to start running TCMC second train service on its existing corridor from La Crosse through Columbus to Milwaukee, while the optional route through Madison is under study? It's not clear how you could begin service on a route through Madison yet. So, any routing of that corridor through Madison is essentially a future vision. Is that correct?
This is Lisa, and yes, that is correct. So currently, the current TCMC project that goes through La Crosse will stay on the existing Empire Builder route, which will go through Columbus, Portage, the Dells, Toma, and La Crosse, obviously. Currently, we're not actually currently studying the route to Madison. It's in the rail plan. It will require additional study to be included in one of these longer distance routes or as an extension of the Hiawatha. That is correct.
Our next question is, it seems from answers so far about Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Twin Cities, HSR, that most planning and discussion is about small incremental improvement to existing infrastructure. That's appropriate for near term. What is the long-term roadmap to move from minor improvements to existing freight mixed infrastructure
towards larger passenger-only projects?
Yeah, so I would put those in a long-term option. That's not something we're actively looking at this point. I think there's a lot of work that we would need to do before we got to that point. So that would be a long-term vision, but there's no current work being looked at having a separate passenger rail only corridor at this point.
Yeah, someday.
Our next question is, Amtrak management has earned itself a negative reputation at times. Would WisDOT consider working with other operators, such as Brightline?
Well, I don't know if Amtrak has earned that or not. I think Amtrak does a lot of good work as well. So I'm not going to comment on the opinion there. But as far as would WisDOT consider working with other operators such as Brightline? Yes, we would. And we are talking with the St. Croix Chippewa Passenger Rail Commission in their plans, and they're looking at alternatives besides Amtrak. I think we are open to different operators, and it really will depend on the specifics of the service, which operator fits best in for providing that passenger rail service.
There is approximately 11 minutes left in today's webinar session. I just wanted to remind our attendees while we wait for additional questions from participants that if you are ready to provide a question to our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Our next question is, any chance of showing less than 1 MGT lines on the map on page 97?
This is Alex. So the map that you're referring to is the forecasted 2050 tons freight rail tonnage. And so that data came from the 2017 IHS Transearch 2050 forecast year. I, to be honest, don't know how that data is split as far as what we use to build this map. That's a comment that we'll take back with our team and look and see if we can offer more granularity in that, showing like 1 million versus 5 million tons as it's currently showed. Thank you.
There are 5 minutes remaining in today's webinar session. I just wanted to remind our attendees that if you have any final questions for our rail plan experts, please join the podium by clicking the Join the Podium button on the right side of your screen. Then submit your question into the chat box. Your question will be addressed in the order submitted. Kurt W. provided a comment. He said, "Thank you to the experts for your time and for your clear answers."
This is Alex. Thank you very much for that. It's always fun with these public meetings, but thank you all for the participation as well. We couldn't have put this meeting on without you and the questions that were provided. So thank you again for the participation.
Ethan J. provided a comment. He says, I agree with Kurt W. Thank you for your efforts in developing the new state rail plan and for hosting today's webinar.
This is Alex again. Thank you all again for your participation. I know we're just about out of time, but yeah, thank you again for jumping on and spending the last hour and a half with us.
It is 11:30. We've reached the conclusion of today's webinar. On behalf of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, thank you for your questions and thank you for joining WisDOT today to discuss the draft Wisconsin Rail Plan 2050. Have a great day.